Welcome to Tech Conversations, now in Season 7, presented by the Florida International University Radcliffe Art and Design Incubator. And I want to welcome in Dr. Amanda Lotz. Welcome again to the podcast.
Thanks, Maggie, for having me back yet again.
So for those of you that may not know her, I do, because I've been following her for a while, and we've had her on with her previous books. Her third book is called After Mass Media, which we will get into. And she is a media scholar, author, and consultant who has been exploring how digital technologies have changed how media industries operate. She's been in this role for almost 2 decades, and she's based out of Queensland University of Technology. So we are thrilled to have you back and talking about how fast changing everything's moving these days, Amanda. Let's kick it off. Why After Mass Media?
I think, as you alluded to, I've been doing this for a while, and the project that I've had in mind or haven't been able to quite wrap my head around for a period of time now has been understanding how just the basic foundation of media has changed. I mean, it's one of those frog in the boiling pot of water, right? Like it's happened so gradually over decades that it's perhaps the thing that most defines the difference in how media operate today. And yet we don't talk about it. We don't have words for it. We rarely pay attention to it. So we know things like that we easily devolve into talking about hits, and we assume that those hits are like they used to be, and they're just not. So the book was a chance to really focus in on the implications and the reality of the fact that our media, even, and I'm not talking about the YouTube creator space, even the big legacy media space, those shows just don't reach the audiences they used to. They aren't mass media anymore. And that's a reality that is important to reckon with for scholars, for industry, and for audiences, albeit for different reasons.
You know, as somebody who's had a front row stage, I started in this business in 92, not to date myself, in the NBC Page program. And I have been in broadcast and in cable and now in streaming. So what makes a hit? What is that formula?
I think that the key is that for that period of mass media, we had that idea. We knew that there were certain components, and it's kind of why, US television looked so similar for so long, right? Up probably through the end of the 80s, and you start to begin to get some change in the 90s, precisely because that's when the audience starts to fragment. And that's the point by which the broadcast networks can no longer take advantage of scarcity. All those old strategies were built on making people watch things they really didn't want to because there weren't a lot of other options. And so the slow boil, if you will, has been the process of audiences figuring out that there are other options. Some of those options, as you know, came originally from cable, doing some different things, and then it's escalated quite quickly in the early 21st century as sort of social media comes along, services like YouTube that allow us to experience video in really different ways, new experiences in gaming, streaming comes along, and we begin to have access to not just a schedule, but really these deep libraries of content, not only recent, but semi-recent and from the distant past. And all of that attention spread means that nobody is watching a thing they don't want to watch anymore. So that kind of least common denominator, or least objectionable programming strategy, it doesn't work anymore. But your question was what does work? And that's what's tough. Increasingly, what works is making content people love, but you can't make content that a lot of people love. We're all too different and interesting and special in our own ways. We want different things. And so the idea of chasing this kind of mythical mass audience is increasingly just a formula for an unsustainable business.
So you said something that I didn't realize it until you just mentioned it now. We had those networks, and we were sort of conditioned to say, oh, we're going to watch Friends, and we're going to watch Special Victims Unit. And it was all the same thing across all the networks, just with different people, a difference here and there. Do you think that the offer of streaming, of having to sit there and just pick what you want, has opened up this new audience where we see like a Bridgerton perform so exuberantly well?
So again, I'm going to back off of the claim that Bridgerton performed exuberantly well, because by past standards, now, I forget, the analyst Matt Ball had a statistic out, and I'm not going to do it right, but it was something like of all the time viewing Netflix last year, time spent watching Bridgerton was like less than 2%, right? And we think it's this giant hit, right? And it's not. It's not a hit. It's just like that's not the conversation anymore. The conversation needs to be, does Bridgerton keep people subscribed subscribing to Netflix and how, right? So yes, I mean, I think part of what drove Aftermath Media was this experience of seeing over the last decade or so, noticing that the stories are expanding and needing to build a kind of understanding of what happened in the industry that made that happen, right? So on one hand, absolutely, we are experiencing enormous change in the sector right now. Things are in flux and going a place that they have never been before, and we can't go back to where we were. So it is, that's often a very negative and concerning story. And, I will often say things like, we are overproducing and that's the problem. And that's, that doesn't sound like a great thing to producers. But on the other hand, we now have, because we have multiple business models, because we have technologies that can gather audiences from a, say, global scale makes it sound bigger than it is. It's not, yes, there are people around the world, but they're not necessarily a lot of them anywhere. But you can gather audiences with particular tastes from a much bigger range. And that's what is making all kinds of stories available. Different kinds of dramas, different kinds of comedies, things that never would have been made before. Sometimes because studios are willing to put such extraordinary money into them. Other times because of the strategy of having a library instead of a schedule, it takes some of that risk away, and they're willing to take bets on things that would have been too dangerous to try before. So as always in life, it's a half full, half empty kind of story.
Are the budgets different? You mentioned that, are the budgets different when it comes to the storytelling?
It ranges, right? Like we live in a world now where we have, the morning show is pretty much like off the chart. I've got this wonderful visual in the book that sort of shows some budget data over time, because it's a television series, it doesn't get released uniformly. And so you have those extraordinary budgets, and we tend to talk a lot about those super high budgets, but that's not normal. And that might have just been a moment of the streamer development as well. But I think the conversation, given the challenges right now, I think for decades we threw more money at content, and as my grandmother would say, the chickens have come home to roost, right? That's wonderful for creative, but that doesn't acknowledge what has happened in terms of the bottom just dropping out in terms of ad-supported linear businesses, and the fact that consumers can't pay forever. So we're coming off of 2 to 3 decades of just radical abnormality, and like 2 decades of abnormality starts to feel normal. So in the 90s, the sector had all of this new money coming in because there were new opportunities to sell things internationally, in the US was a bit ahead with cable, but so there's giant markets, giant international money coming in the 90s. In the 2000s, then you had the dynamic shifting again and new demand, and we had also in the 90s you had the DVD money, right? Like, so we had money, and that fed the sense that budget constantly goes up. But now with the demise of US cable, which was I guess it's hard from a consumer perspective. American consumers were really paying the bill for drama and comedy production globally. We were hostage to it, right? Because there was no option. It was the giant cable package where the cost had kept going up and up, or kind of 3-channel. And once Americans got options via the internet, go back to that thing about it. So that was the other sort of, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like I want to say that in the last talk we had, I mentioned that to you. I said, but I don't think a lot has changed really, because we were being held hostage to the cable package. But now it's a little bit of the same with the streamers. Like, you either have a Hulu, a Disney, a Warner Brothers, a Netflix, or an Amazon Prime, or an Amazon, but you still subscribe to at least 3 services, or Apple TV Plus. I forgot about that one. It seems to have like the least amount of content that's offered to a subscriber. And in my view, I feel like it's changed because you're not tied to that whole package. If you're not a sports enthusiast like myself, I'm more about more content, not sports. I felt like, I'm paying $100 a month, and then I have all these sports channels I don't watch, right? But now it's like, I'll be honest with you, I only pay 1 subscription, and that's for Netflix. And then my sons, who are students, have student rates they have at least 2 or 3 of them that I'm aware of. And then we're Prime members, so we have Amazon Prime.
Yeah,
so
and I think
that's the consumer still being hostage.
In contrast to a world where it was you had cable and you had all of these fees associated with it, and you're really locked in unless you're moving, right? And there were, you didn't have a lot of choice. Whereas with the streaming services, at least at this point, you can come in and out pretty easily. easily. Like the idea that everyone is going to have everything all the time, no, not unless I mean, that's just impossible, right? Like people only have so much leisure time. And I think what's always shifting back and forth, like between talking to regular people about how they use media and then looking at the conversation in the industry, like, of course, like in the industry, this is all we think about. It's all we have time for. But most people, they work a full day, they come home, they feed their family and do some jobs around the house, and they just want to like sit down and, watch something for an hour or two, if that, right? So the idea that everyone needs all of these libraries, people are figuring it out.
They are. I think my question also goes to, we have these services that are paid for, right? But then we have the ones that are free, like a Pluto TV. So how, because, I talk to different distributors. I buy content for the platform that I work for. And I hear that the revenue share model doesn't really give them a lot, right? Yep. So in terms of selling content, in my view, as someone who's been a buyer for so many years, I feel like the distributors now make more money than they used to before, because before it was just like, oh, you get your cable window and your broadcast window. There was no streaming. And now you can sell it to broadcast, you can sell it to cable, you can sell it to streaming. Somebody can have a window. There's hardly any exclusivity. If you want to pay for exclusivity, you're going to put out that huge amount of money. Like, for example, Univision's VIX service has a lot of exclusives that I'm aware of that they pay top dollar for. But in a platform like mine, I work for Canela Media, we only have a certain amount of originals that the company produces, and then there's co-productions, and then there's things that we buy from other people where we get a streaming window. That doesn't mean that it's not going to air on broadcast or cable at another Hispanic network. So in your view, Amanda, are people making more money on content right now?
No, it doesn't seem that way. I mean, I think right now the market, we haven't figured this out yet. We still there are far too many providers that are offering the same thing.
Exactly.
And that will change over time. I think it already is, right?
Yeah, that's always been my observation as well. It's like you can go to one streaming service and then you see things across different streaming services. So unless you have specific things like what Amazon Prime does as an original, or a Netflix original, or an Apple TV series, or Hulu, or Disney Plus, that they have their originals, everything else seems to be like it's just a catalog that you put on there.
Right. And I think that it speaks as well to the fact that this is still kind of a new world, right? Like this idea of programming a library instead of a schedule, like an understanding audience that has choice. And so, I think we're seeing somewhat less exclusivity these days. I think it depends on the nature of the provider. I don't think the industry has figured out the makeup of the streaming audience. And that's not about demographics. It's about what you have. Some people who really love television and will pay for multiple services and who need to watch things as soon as they come out. And you need to look at how much money you can make from them. And, you have to have services designed for that audience. And then you have to recognize that a lot of your audience, they like some shows and movies, don't make it hard. Don't make it too expensive. They're also not so picky. And it's figuring out that new makeup of, there are things that everyone loves. There are things that people who can pay for will pay for, but it's much more diffuse than it used to be. And so it's figuring out the business model that matches up with that kind of audience spread and the significant cost of some content production, and probably trying to figure out how to spend less. In the strategy of that old era across media industries was intentional overproduction, right? That's the idea that everything's not going to hit. Why do you make it? Because nobody knows what's going to hit. But the challenge I would put to the industry is we know more now. We have depths of data we've never had before. I'm not talking about engineering shows out of that data, but we should be able to overproduce less, or use that kind of range of overproduction to be a little bit more strategic, and recognize that instead of making shows that end up being watched by very few at all because no one really likes them, that you have small audiences for a lot of shows, but those small audiences love the thing that they're being given. And that's a change in thinking that I don't think's gotten to be all that widespread.
Yeah, I mean, I think as somebody who, I'm not an avid streaming watcher. I mean, I pick and choose what I want to watch, I guess, depending on who I like that's in the show. Like last night I was watching the 4 seasons on Netflix. Okay. right? So that
Yeah,
seems
it's in my queue. I haven't gotten to it yet.
Oh, you're gonna love it. I'm only on the 3rd episode, so I love it. I love Tina Fey, and Alan Alda comes out in the show, so it's really incredible, that we're able to have this type of content that maybe otherwise wouldn't have ended up either on cable or broadcast, which I think is a lot of the times what I'm looking at, and some of the stuff that's being consumed. I don't think that maybe the executives in programming would have been innovative and forward thinking enough to put some of these things on their platforms, right? And I think that's where streaming sort of stepped in and gave it a new window, a new outlet for people to kind of see this content. Again, like you said, we're not everyone's making all this money that they're saying. We do have, some data. I look at data all the time and I see the time watched, and it really amazes me to have this, because for years we dealt with Nielsen. We know Nielsen is a sample. It's not representative. And now we have this native, I like to call it sort of the native data. And then for Netflix, I think, they have X amount of subscribers and they have their data. They're not always releasing numbers. They like to keep it quiet. They're infamous for that. And I feel like streaming has really changed the way, like you mentioned in the rundown of things that I sent you earlier that we were going to discuss, budgets for storytelling have changed, the way things are rolled out has changed. And I guess I want to get into the next thing, which is cable innovation, which was on the rundown of the things I wanted to talk about. Because, for example, I want to touch upon Hallmark, because Hallmark did something. Maybe you're not aware of this, but I am, because I'm an avid watcher of that show on Hallmark. There's a show called The Way Home. I believe it's going into season 3 or 4. And they said last year, the show only comes around once a year. You know this. Hallmark only releases things once a year. So God forbid that you're not alive the year after to watch your show. And they said that they were moving the show to Hallmark Plus. Oh my God. Amanda, I'm one of those people that goes in and reads comments, because I am a programmer and I really am the advocate of the viewer. So I wanted to see what reaction people had. I myself wrote in the email and said, no, as somebody who's been in programming for a while, you can't take a show that you've given them for X amount of seasons on cable, they're paying their cable package, and then move it to a streaming service for them to have to spend X amount of dollars to watch the show. And I will tell you, they heard this commotion and they made an announcement saying that they were taking the show back to cable and that it would stream the next day on Hallmark. Your reaction?
I think we have seen and continue to see these things. I think the fact that it was an established show, I agree with you. I mean, that kind of move is, I think viewers can see through that kind of manipulation. But at the same time, we have other channels sort of, whenever you're launching something originally on a streamer, that is happening all of the time. And, you just don't have a passionate audience to sort of, that begins to feel violated. So I think into my industries class, and we have this example. There was this YouTube channel called Watcher, and it tried to shift to being subscriber funded as well. And very similar to your story, people were just outraged by this. But I think it all depends on where your perspective is. The creators were talking about, they make content that looks professional. It's not, low budget at all. And they were saying, we can't do what we're doing on this business model anymore, and we need some more reliability. And so I understand those pressures as well. I try to be generous, and so I wouldn't assume that the Hallmark folks were trying to abuse their audience, but it may be a matter that the revenue that they've got coming in at this point from cable is really, they would be able to perhaps do more if they had more people paying for a streaming service. And they might be that kind of, is everyone going to have Hallmark? No, but is it has a very specific audience that loves it a lot, and so that audience might actually be able to be better served by having that kind of dedicated service. It's hard to say. I don't get to see all the numbers that you get to see.
The thing is, there were people from Australia, just so you know, on those forums complaining.
I don't doubt it. We have nothing like it.
I do want to say that Hallmark, to me, their strategy seems blurry to me as a programmer, because I have been on their service and I did pay it because I wanted to watch some holiday movies. I am guilty of that. And then I canceled my subscription. And I'll tell you why I canceled it. Because the movies are on there first, and then they made it to the cable channel. And the same thing with a show called like The Chicken Sisters, which I was dying to see. And now it's on cable. So I feel like they're making people pay for things that they're rolling out on the cable channel months after. So, I mean, right?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough time in terms of
Yeah.
knowing where to put your content. And I think earlier could try to nudge people in one direction or another. But I think we've gotten to the point where cable has lost so many viewers. You don't want to give up that audience entirely. So I think it's tough to know what to do with your content. And I think we seem to be moving into an era where there's less exclusivity. So maybe that will give more options for viewers.
Yeah. I mean, Amanda, I could always have you here for like 24 hours talking about all the questions that I always have and all my impressions and, and conclusions of things. But I really want to hone in on what can we expect in Aftermath Media that we didn't see in the first two books.
Aftermath Media is, so my job, the thing I actually get paid for is not the books so much, it's being a professor. And so this is more of a book that's sort of ticking the box that shows I'm still doing academic professor work.
I saw that. I saw the book. I think I want to use that, but we have to go through such an intricate process at FIU to adopt the book. So let me see how we get around that. But I would love to use your book in a class that just got certified called RTV 3007, which is the Introduction to Radio Television. And I did look over the book, of course, before we came on the talk. And it did seem to me like there was a lot of interesting information there that really kind of like, I want to call it like the plane landing, some of your graphs in there and some of the comparisons that you showcase. So go ahead.
I think that's a key way that it's different. And that doesn't mean, or at least I've tried to write it in a way that, still, my undergraduates can read. And so it's not off anywhere, but it's less about like, this is how to make the business work. I think about the work in this way. Like we all work in whatever industry we work in. I'm a professor, right? And I've been doing this for like 25 years. And like, I know it's changed over time. And like, I can look at my syllabus from now versus 10 years and I'm going, wow, like what I used to have students do, or wow, like, things have changed, but like, because you're the one who's experiencing, you don't really have the sense of what happened. And so I read this book about a year ago by someone who explained what had happened to higher ed over the last 30 years, the business of it and how education's changed because of it and working in it. And it was like, oh, like I've been in it the whole time, but I didn't have that big picture. And so a little bit, I think of this book in that way. We've all been watching TV probably over 20, 30 years. Many people have been working in it in various ways, but you're always dealing with the crisis of the moment, or you hear this really big announcement and maybe nothing comes of it, or, we never know in the moment. And so this was an attempt to sort of talk about like what had happened, like if we look at a 30-year trajectory, like how can we understand why the stories have changed? And then the back half of the book, I think, is really pushing to think about TV series or any kind of series in some different ways. And it's a little bit more of, academics have been very obsessed historically with country of origin, where is it made? And also been very concerned about the demographics of the characters in stories in terms of diversity. And those are fine things to be concerned about. But I think what we've seen in terms of audience behavior with these global streaming services that often offer nothing, or 1% of their programming is from the country that subscriber is in. I think we're seeing that there are other things that are also important to viewers. And maybe by over focusing still on those old concerns, we're not asking the question of what else makes a show resonate with someone than whether or not it's from their country or whether they see someone who looks like themselves in a role. And I guess it's a challenge, I think, to folks who study the sector and work in the sector to begin to think in new ways about why audiences connect. I mean, we've got these great examples, but then we don't necessarily do the work to understand them. So something like Squid Game, which no one would have expected could happen, right? So why is it that this show out of Korea was popular around the globe? Like let's dig into that and let's explore that too, rather than just relying on a lot of our old assumptions. It's a weird week to be saying that, given that the news about possible U.S. tariffs and all that out of the U.S. So
I mean, you're like a whole world away. Watching it from afar.
Well, But in a market that's very concerned about it, because
Yes,
there's a
very
fair bit of
concerned.
Hollywood production here. So,
I
and
think,
it
I
has
think,
different consequences in other countries, and it's also can be, I mean, it can be positive and negative. So,
I think with those news, I think people took a step back and became very conservative in their budgets. I know that my company included, we're always looking to find new partnerships and new ways to work with content distributors, as is the rest of the world when it comes to trying to close deals. You know, revenue share is great, but we all know that revenue share, unless you have a huge audience behind it, is not going to generate thousands of dollars. And as we know it, you know, I run a kids service. Kids monetization is fairly low. And in the US, you know, we have the COPA compliance issues and not running ads and what can run and what can, and advertisers tend to stay away from it. So those are challenges that are faced in the middle of this whole thing, right? With the tariffs, everyone's unsure. So people take a step back. So I think my question is, Amanda, given that we've spoken 3 different times now, and we started talking, I think about a year and a half or 2 years ago with your first podcast, are we in the streaming wars currently? Because, you know, Evan Shapiro posts every single day. And he says, I think now we're in the YouTube war. Is that what he said last?
yeah, so it's all, I guess it's all attention war to a degree. And money, I mean, this is what business is, right? You try to get people to buy your thing and not somebody else's thing, and convince people that they need your thing. So, you know, it is the business of media. I think the place where I very much do agree with Evan is the need to stop thinking about legacy and digital, or whatever, you know, you want to call that dichotomy, as separate entities. People of very many ages consume across the spectrum. So the key is beginning to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, and then I think to build back companies accordingly, or strategies accordingly. And I think I've been trying to do some new work on you know, that creator space, and it's really difficult because it's so multi-faceted, and we can't just kind of even call it YouTube. Like, YouTube is so many things at this point. It's how-to videos. It's, as Evans pointed out, videos from Channel 4 and CBC. It's young people who have effectively made what look like, you know, they look to me like talk shows. So then apparently we're all watching podcasts now on YouTube as well. I think sort of step one is pulling apart the different business models that are there, the different kinds of content that are there, and understanding what is of value of those different things, and, you know, what is it that's compelling audiences to that space. And often I think it's the specificity. People can find exactly what they want. I think it's such, YouTube, speaking of as a service, it's such a large collection because of how they pay, which doesn't pay everyone, and it works reasonably well to find what you want. But I think it's still the case that viewers, there are still things that aren't in that space and not being made well. And I would say it's drama and comedy, or scripted comedy. There's a thing of comedy there for sure. Yes. And so I think, and recognizing that the business model that exists there is unlikely to be able to support drama, right? You can't.
I think so. I agree there. Yeah.
And so understanding what that space can't do, and acknowledging though that viewers are spending a lot of time in following their very specific interests because they can. And so it comes back to, you know, making stories that people really love, and figuring out how to do that, and thinking about that first, and thinking about scale second. And that's just a very different way of thinking.
So Amanda, as we wind down, your final thoughts and forward looking on where we are today. Given that there's so much uncertainty on this side of the world.
I'm very aware that I'm someone who wrote first about a post-network era in 2006, and that's like 20 years ago. Wow. Are we there yet? We're getting closer, I think, to getting.
Okay. Oh my God.
Honestly, Maggie, the thing that concerns me the most about fragmentation is that I don't see anyone kind of really paying attention to maintaining a way to make content, like the kind of scripted stuff, right? There's so much attention to distribution, like things like fast channels, they can't afford content. We just talked about, you know, that YouTube model, it can't afford original drama. I think my concern is that when we all spread out too much, what will be possible in in terms of those kind of scripted stories still. And I think in some ways, being somewhere like Australia, I think we are experiencing all of the crises, but before they get maybe to the US or, the UK, they're coming. And so like we're in an environment where our commercial broadcasters made 9 hours of drama last year. That's down from well over 100. Like, so they still do make 2 soap operas, or 1 soap opera now, but it's not because the commercial broadcasters are awful. It's because that's what their business models really allow for at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because, I grew up watching that lineup of the daytime soap opera, like Days of Our Lives, The Young and the Restless. None of that exists anymore. That's not part of any schedule.
No, and so like there's something equivalent, like audiences are finding a thing that fulfills that need. It's just, it obviously looks different. And so this question of what level of production can continue and where does it happen? And is it making stories for the globe? Is it making different kinds of stories? And when I say the globe, for a global audience, like the question of the real concern, at least in Australia, and it's a concern in other small to mid-sized countries, is how do we continue to afford to have any kind of fictional storytelling about our place? And that's not to say that needs to be or can be the only thing, and it's certainly not the only thing people want, but some. Like 50 hours a year, maybe, and that has implications for the industry, and it has implications for society. So I think trying to balance that kind of cultural policy in the midst of a sector that is now truly global and in an environment of economic shrinking, it's really tough, and it requires vision and compromise and leadership. Let me know if you find some.
That's like a whole other podcast conversation. Well, Dr. Amanda Lotz, thank you again for joining our podcast now in season 7. Thank you so much, Amanda. You're a wealth of information and someone that, we follow across the platforms. And I know sometimes Evan Shapiro also is commenting, and we like to listen to what he says, but you bring a different theory to it with your educational expertise. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me back.